We're on week 8 of the series that we've been doing on the fruit of the Spirit, these qualities that God grows in us. And week 8 out of 9 means this week we're on to gentleness. And it's a word which is often associated, I guess, with acting in a caring, soft, calm way with a little bit of tenderness, maybe. That's what it's all about. And I guess in our modern life where success is often associated with perhaps being quite bolshy or dominant even, gentleness can sometimes seem to take a back seat in terms of priorities which are championed. And yet because it's a fruit of the Spirit, if we're not gentle, then we're going to be in some ways incomplete as the people who God, through his Spirit, wants us to be. So what might it mean to be gentle, to exhibit gentleness? Well, to help out thinking on this, we're going to look at Jesus' story from Mark's Gospel. And a little bit of background to this. So Jesus is in the town of Capernaum, just by the Sea of Galilee, and he's been informed that the daughter of the local synagogue leader there, a guy called Jairus, his daughter is dying. And yet, as Jesus makes his way to her house, on his way, his cloak is touched by the bleeding woman whose story we've looked at before. And although she's healed in that action by Jesus, it delays Jesus from getting to Jairus' house to see his daughter, meaning that we pick up the story in Mark's Gospel with this news.
While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and told them to give her something to eat.
So it's a story of a miraculous healing by Jesus, but also I'd suggest one which has a lot to teach us about gentleness. What in particular might we think? Well, if we notice, for a start, on hearing the reports that the girl has died, Jesus only allows the girl's mum and dad and just his 3 closest disciples, Peter, James, and John, to go with him inside the house. It's almost as if knowing what he was going to do, he wanted to ensure perhaps that the atmosphere inside the house was one of calm, in stark contrast, as we're told, to all the commotion and the loud wailing that was going on outside. I guess we could say Jesus longs to bring calmness and clarity to our lives, even in times, or perhaps especially in times of real trauma. What else? Well, we're told that Jesus then takes the girl by the hand. And that's interesting because Jesus doesn't need to touch someone for them to be healed. After all, in this town of Capernaum, Jesus, on another occasion, heals someone without even seeing them, without even being near them, such as when he heals the centurion's servant from afar. So Jesus doesn't need to be close physically to someone to heal them. But here, Jesus deliberately, it seems, takes hold of the girl's hand. And it's a gesture of care, yes, but I think it also suggests that Jesus would have knelt down beside her bed. So Jesus treats her with tenderness. And we can imagine how special it would be to have Jesus himself gently take you by the hand. And he then speaks to her, words which the writer Mark chooses to leave in Jesus' native language, which is Aramaic. Jesus says, Talitha kum, essentially, little girl, wake up. And again, because there's so few people in the room, it's unlikely Jesus has to raise his voice. It's unlikely he shouts, as he does, for example, when he tells Lazarus to come out of his tomb. No, instead, I suspect it's more the kind of gentle rousing of a sleeping child, Come on, up you get, that kind of tone, if you like. And again, because he probably says it when kneeling next to her, when the girl does open her eyes, I suspect she won't be freaked out by a sort of towering figure above her, but reassured by the gentleness of the healer who is now beside her bedside. And so we're told immediately that she stands up and walks around, much to the astonishment of Peter, James and John and her mum and dad. And yet what does Jesus do? Well, he focuses on her practical needs. First thing he says is, give her something to eat. Understanding perhaps how hungry she would have been after being so poorly in the previous days. And if you know how much 12-year-olds eat, I'm not surprised by that, because they can get through a fridge full, I tell you. But then intriguingly, Jesus then gives his 3 disciples and the mum and dad strict orders not to let anyone know about the details of the healing. Now, why would Jesus do this? Why would he want to keep a lid on it? Well, Jesus doesn't explain himself, and it may be about his desire to ensure he didn't become pigeonholed as a miracle worker when his message was much broader than that. But I wonder if it's not also at least in part to do with Jesus wanting to protect this little girl from unnecessary attention, to ensure that she's not forever known in the street as the dead girl who Jesus healed, since that's quite the label for anyone to carry, let alone a girl of her young years. Jesus knows that she's now got the rest of her life ahead of her, and I think above all wants her to embrace life, not forever be associated or remembering the fact that she died. Indeed, I wonder if that's why Jesus insists on describing her only as sleeping as he does. Yes, to us, we know the full story. It seems clear she has indeed died and Jesus brings her back to life. But perhaps Jesus says she was only sleeping because that would be easier language for the girl to process and use than dealing with the trauma of the fact that she has indeed died. Now, we can't be sure, but that sounds to me like the kind of empathetic consideration that the compassionate, caring, hand-holding Jesus would give. Indeed, I'd say all these qualities and more that Jesus demonstrates here are helpful pointers perhaps for us as to what gentleness looks like in practice. I could say choosing to treat people with calmness and compassion, treating people with touching tenderness, treating people with empathy and kindness. And the good news, as we see in this story, is that Jesus exhibits gentleness in abundance. He knows what he's doing in a gentle way. And I pray for us that through God's Spirit with us, we too would be able to exhibit those same qualities, that same fruit, in the gentle way that we treat all those who God has given us to live alongside.